Hey guys, tonight we're talking about how Donald Trump basically became that neighbour who loudly calls out everyone else's messy yard while standing on his perfectly manicured lawn. Except, instead of overgrown grass, we're talking about European immigration policies that made Trump so uncomfortable, he decided to publicly roast an entire continent like it was a bad Yelp review. But first things first, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, whether you're trying to fall asleep to international political drama or wondering how world leaders throw shade through press conferences. So picture this. Donald Trump, fresh off becoming president again, steps off Air Force One in Scotland and immediately decides to deliver the kind of blunt truth that European leaders have been desperately trying to avoid hearing. Upon his arrival in Scotland, Trump declared that immigration is killing Europe and told leaders they need to get your act together or you're not going to have Europe anymore. It was like watching the one guy who predicted the house party would get out of control finally showing up to say, "I told you so." Except, this time, he happened to be the President of the United States, and the house was literally burning down around them. Trump called the situation a horrible invasion, with all the diplomatic finesse of someone pointing out that the emperor isn't wearing clothes, which would have been easier to dismiss if he hadn't been absolutely right about the whole mess from the beginning. Europe has been dealing with what you could generously call an immigration situation for years. The whole thing ramped up around 2015, when Europe opened its doors with Black Friday shopper enthusiasm. Except instead of discounted electronics, they were dealing with millions of people seeking asylum, basically anywhere that wasn't actively on fire. The numbers were staggering. Over 1 million asylum seekers in 2015 alone. That's like the entire population of Montana showing up asking if they can crash on your couch. Except Montana probably has better documentation. Germany took in the most. Angela Merkel basically said, "Sure, come on in, we'll figure it out as we go." Which sounds noble until you realise it's like inviting everyone you've ever met to your wedding without checking if your venue can handle more than 50 people. Meanwhile, other European countries had reactions ranging from reluctant cooperation to absolutely not thank you very much. Hungary built an actual fence. Poland took a "we told you so" approach with healthy smugness. The integration process went about as smoothly as you'd expect when you take millions of people from completely different cultures and try to blend them into societies already struggling with identity issues. It was like merging several jigsaw puzzles without looking at the box pictures first. Crime rates started fluctuating in ways that made politicians nervous. European leaders found themselves trying to address legitimate safety concerns without sounding like they were blaming entire groups, a tightrope walk that would make circus performers dizzy. While European leaders congratulated themselves on their moral superiority, reality was doing what it does best, completely ignoring good intentions and creating problems that couldn't be solved with feel-good press conferences. Processing centres became overcrowded faster than a Starbucks during finals week. Facilities designed for hundreds suddenly dealt with thousands. Processing times stretched from weeks to, "we'll get back to you eventually maybe." People were stuck in bureaucratic limbo longer than that lost package you're still waiting for. This created a parallel society of people who were physically present but legally invisible. They couldn't work legally, couldn't access services, couldn't do anything except wait, like being stuck in the world's most depressing game of bureaucratic limbo. The job market situation was brutal. Highly educated professionals, doctors, engineers, teachers, suddenly competed for entry-level positions. A Syrian brain surgeon would wash dishes because his medical degree wasn't recognised, and getting it recognised involved more paperwork than buying a house. Housing was even worse. European cities already had shortages that made finding affordable apartments about as likely as finding a unicorn that does your taxes. Adding millions of people was like solving traffic congestion by adding more cars. Cultural conflicts popped up like mushrooms after rain. Traditional European values clashed with conservative practices in ways that created legal dilemmas that would make philosophy professors dizzy. How do you balance religious freedom with women's rights? These weren't theoretical discussions anymore. They were real situations affecting real people. Crime statistics showed patterns that made everyone uncomfortable. Some areas saw increases in petty crime and sexual assault that couldn't be dismissed as just poverty-related. European leaders found themselves in the impossible position of addressing safety concerns without appearing to blame entire populations. European politicians were doing what they do best, spinning the situation while secretly panicking about approval ratings. It was like convincing someone their house isn't on fire, while smoke pours out the windows behind them. The political landscape shifted faster than 2000s fashion trends. Parties considered fringe were gaining support not because people became horrible overnight, but because mainstream politicians were so busy virtue signalling they forgot to address actual problems. Angela Merkel's approval ratings dropped faster than a phone with a cracked screen. The woman who built her brand on being the responsible adult was suddenly the one who invited millions to a party without checking venue capacity. The Alternative for Germany party went from flip phone relevance to collecting seats like Pokemon cards. Their message was simple: we told you this was bad, now look what happened. Other countries started pointing fingers at Germany like classroom kids when the teacher asks who made the mess. Hungary's Viktor Orbán went from troublemaker to the guy who warned everyone about wet paint. His approval ratings actually improved, incredibly satisfying in that I hate being right about terrible things way. The EU started showing cracks that made the Grand Canyon look like a sidewalk scratch. Countries that had cooperated for decades suddenly couldn't agree on basics like how many people should we let in. Brexit suddenly made more sense to British people. The immigration crisis gave them a concrete example of EU policies affecting their lives without their input. The Leave campaign just had to point at continental Europe and ask, do you want this to be your problem too? France saw Marine Le Pen gain support from people who'd never considered far-right parties. Sweden experienced cultural growing pains, with areas developing reputations for being unsafe. The Netherlands dealt with housing shortages, while their own citizens couldn't find places to live. European leaders found themselves admitting their policies might have been more optimistic than realistic. The situation created a political environment where admitting problems gave ammunition to extremist parties, but ignoring problems made those parties more popular. There was Europe, dealing with a situation spiralling faster than an unbalanced washing machine, when along comes Trump with all the diplomatic subtlety of a marching band at a library. And this is where it gets interesting. Trump said out loud what many were thinking but were too polite or terrified to actually say. Trump was watching this slow-motion disaster like a homeowner whose neighbour's house party got completely out of control. When he finally unleashed his thoughts, it was with all the restraint of a toddler told they can't have candy before dinner. His critique wasn't sophisticated, but it was effective in that brutally honest way that makes everyone uncomfortable because it's true. He basically said, remember when I told you this was bad? Remember when you called me racist? How's that working out now? The timing was particularly brutal because it came from the current President of the United States, when European leaders were already dealing with plummeting approval ratings and growing realization that good intentions don't solve practical problems. It was like getting kicked when you're down by someone you'd previously dismissed as an idiot. Trump's approach was quintessentially American, direct, undiplomatic, completely unconcerned with hurt feelings. As the sitting president, he asked obvious questions everyone else was too polite to ask. Why did you let in millions without proper vetting? Why didn't you have an integration plan? Why are you surprised this created problems? The European response was a masterclass in missing the point. Instead of addressing his complaints, they focused on his tone and credentials. It was like responding to someone pointing out your house is on fire by criticizing their grammar, except now that someone was the President of the United States. What made Trump's criticism particularly stinging was that it wasn't from some far-right European politician who could be dismissed. This was the current US president, representing a country that had avoided the specific disasters unfolding in Europe, and he was saying this from the world's most powerful office. Trump's comments forced European politicians to articulate their policies in concrete terms rather than humanitarian platitudes. When the President of the United States asks directly, "Why did you think this would work?" you can't just respond with, "Because it's the right thing to do." His intervention was particularly effective because he wasn't trying to be diplomatic. He was speaking as the leader of the free world who had predicted this mess years ago. He identified obvious problems and stated them in terms anyone could understand. Sometimes the most effective criticism is just pointing out that obvious problems everyone can see are, in fact, problems. Here we are, watching the aftermath of what might be history's most expensive lesson in the difference between good intentions and good policy. While European leaders were offended by Trump's lack of diplomatic niceties, their citizens dealt with real-world consequences of policies that sounded great in seminars, but worked like chocolate teapots. The numbers don't lie, even when politicians wish they would. By 2024, European statistics painted a picture that looked less like successful integration and more like a social experiment gone completely wrong. Crime rates had increased so dramatically that even creative statisticians couldn't spin them into good news. Germany dealt with crime statistics that made their police look like they were losing against reality. Sweden found itself with no-go zones where police needed backup to deliver parking tickets. France's sensitive urban zones became political speak for places where our policies created problems we can't solve. What made it particularly frustrating was that European leaders seemed more concerned with international reputations than addressing problems their policies created. The disconnect between political rhetoric and lived experience became so obvious that even mainstream media started quietly acknowledging challenges. Integration programs designed with the effectiveness of screen doors on submarines were quietly overhauled. Language requirements previously considered racist were suddenly practical necessities. Cultural orientation programs dismissed as discriminatory became mutual understanding initiatives. The economic costs were staggering. Initial estimates had been so optimistic they bordered on fantasy, like budgeting for weekend camping and paying for a luxury cruise. The political landscape shifted so dramatically that fringe extremist parties were winning elections with platforms that basically said, maybe try policies that actually work. Trump's criticism was particularly effective in retrospect because he'd been making these points for years. His warnings, dismissed as racist fear-mongering, turned out to be remarkably accurate predictions. While European politicians focused on moral dimensions, Trump asked practical questions. Who pays? Where will they live? How will you integrate them? European leaders found themselves implementing policies that looked suspiciously like what Trump had advocated, while maintaining the fiction they weren't changing their approach. Border controls quietly strengthened. Deportation procedures streamlined. Integration requirements implemented as mutual benefit programs. The human cost was perhaps most tragic. People promised integration often found themselves in limbo, unable to return home, but unable to fully participate in new countries. Europe's attempt to be more humanitarian actually created less humane conditions for everyone involved. As we look at this saga, it's a cautionary tale about balancing moral aspirations with practical realities. Europe's heart was right, but their execution was like performing surgery with kitchen utensils while blindfolded. Trump's role wasn't as the villain stopping humanitarian efforts, but as the inconvenient voice pointing out the emperor was naked. His criticism was harsh and undiplomatic, but largely accurate in assessing problems European policies were creating. The lesson isn't that immigration is bad or helping people is wrong. It's that good intentions without good planning create bad outcomes for everyone. Europe learned this the hard way, at enormous cost to their societies, politics, and the very people they tried to help. And Trump, he got to be right about something important while being his usual diplomatically challenged self, which probably made it even more irritating for European leaders who had to admit the guy they'd called an idiot had actually seen problems they'd missed. So, there you have it. How Europe's immigration experiment became a cautionary tale about the difference between sounding good and actually working. A reminder that reality has a way of ignoring our best intentions and demanding actual solutions. Sweet dreams, safe travels, and remember to subscribe if you enjoyed this journey through modern political irony. Because apparently, even in our sophisticated 21st century, we're still learning that good intentions need good planning. Who knew?